for those who don't know PhotoWings, make sure to check out. It's an organization that is putting a massive resources in free access to education, and that it stands very close to what we at Seven are trying to do. So today we have Justin again with us, and this last time we spoke mainly about cameras and mechanics behind it and electronics behind it, but today's sessions will be about lenses, and between these two sessions we are trying to explain how to harness the powers of the tools you use. We mentioned earlier in a previous session that photography is a craft, and knowing what your camera can and cannot do is definitely part of it. And for many of those who are younger and who missed the glorious days of silver photography and who missed endless hours of developing, processing, and so on, it may be something useful, and it's something that it may sound nerdy at moments, but I guess all photographers are nerdy to a certain degree. But I think it's a definite must, especially now that we are living in an age where cameras can do so much more than they could 10 years ago. Video, photos, now for the first time, most of the cameras that all of us have can do both, and they can do it really well, but only if we as operators of that machinery can harness that power. So here is Justin with fresh cup of tea. Justin, thank you very much for joining us again. Just a few housekeeping rules for our audience. We are recording this, so we are not broadcasting anymore because we feel this provides better level of intimacy. So all of those who registered will also receive a link to a recording of this session. I'm sure Justin will answer all of your questions regarding Fuji. So make sure to use Q&A box in your Zoom application. We are gonna try to aggregate all those questions for Justin and answer them. So feel free to ask questions as we go along. Don't wait till last moment. So Justin, welcome back. And where are we today?
Well, thank you, and great to be here. And yes, please ask questions. I mean, I kind of went through my cupboards and my closets and pulled out a whole bunch of optics and have things sort of scattered all around me. So I have to not talk with my hands too much today because I've got, this guy sitting right here, a cine lens, which you noticed immediately just because it helps me show some things and demonstrate some things. But yeah, I really want to talk about optics because if we look at our tools, our building blocks of photography, especially digital, we have camera bodies with sensors and we have lenses, right? We got the thing that actually makes the image. And lenses came about before cameras came about. So it's older technology. Things like little pinhole cameras. I mean, I don't know if anyone's used these little guys in the past or taken an oatmeal box. I remember taking an oatmeal box, the round, like in the US, a Quaker Oats cylinder. Taking that, putting a piece of foil in it, cutting a little hole out, poking a pinhole through it, and putting a piece of 8x10 black and white or color paper in there, going outside, exposing it for hours potentially, and then coming inside, processing that piece of paper and seeing what you got, and then having a paper negative, maybe peeling it and making a positive print from it. So kind of cool technology, lots of things we can do. But lenses are kind of a really critical thing, and there's different types, there's different generations of lenses. Optics, one might say it's changed a lot, and one might say it's changed a little. The evolution of lens design has gotten better and better over the years, from what was done, 100 years ago to what's done now with computer-aided design, with new cameras, with mirrorless cameras, and short back focus distances, right? Not having mirrors to clear, it's allowed lens designers a lot more freedom in what they can do going forward. So it's creating new lenses different performance of lenses, making a lot of things easier for them. And then we talk about glass design. We can talk about spherical lens elements. So aspheres versus spherical, and how that affects image quality. And it gives designers freedom to do different things. So lenses that were dreams of, 1.0 lenses, 0.95 lenses used to be really hard to do because there had to be someone that could polish. Like if I go back to the earliest lenses like that, there were some 50 millimeter 1.0s, 0.95 that came out of Canon in the 50s in Japan. It required hand polished spherics to do those lenses. And only so many people could do that. There was huge amounts of waste. That's why those lenses were really expensive. And so updating newer principles, newer ways of constructing glass, vacuum formed glass. So being able to actually press form a piece of glass into a more complex shape is a fairly recent, in the last sort of 20 to 30 years, a fairly recent development. So it's given designers a lot of freedom and a lot of flexibility to do stuff, and just cost of glass. So in a grand scheme of things, the amount of glass that was available, say 30, 40 years ago, there was a lot more optical glass available. Places were developing new optical glass. Schott in Germany and other manufacturers were actually developing new glass types to do different things. And then we had a lot of the environmental impact in the 80s and looking at the quality of that glass and going back and redesigning, getting rid of heavy metals in glass. I have some lenses around that if you would put a Geiger counter to them are going to register on it because they use lanthanum, they use other heavy metals to actually help bend the light and increase the indice of refraction, so increase how much that lens bends light. And that was the way to do it. Well, now there's other ways of doing it. They found other ways. So there's not lead in glass. And it's from the manufacturing standpoint, it's also from human exposure standpoint, right? And a famous old lens that people love is something called an Aero Ektar. It was designed during World War II. Kodak designed it for aero reconnaissance. And they're long focal lengths, I believe 178 millimeter f2.5. I've had a couple of them over the years. They're a lot of fun to play with, but they have a lanthanum element in them. And the radiation from that element actually yellows the glass over time. So it changes the color of the glass. And so they're great for black and white, but not so good for color photography because everything comes out really warm. But yeah, just lots of different things, lots of different ways we can go. But that's part of the thing. Talk about some technology, talk about design. We can talk about why designers are choosing what they're choosing now, but also talk about some little things like field of view. I think that's an important topic to talk about is field of view. But also, since I have some cine lenses kicking around, we can talk about things like breathing, which I think motion is becoming more and more important. So terms like parfocal, terms like breathing can be really important to know what they are, and you'll realize why this cine lens costs what it does versus a photographic lens that doesn't have the same characteristics. It requires more engineering. It requires different requirements.
So because obviously it's an endless discussion ever since the advent of the digital. Photographers been bragging or nagging about the full frame versus whatever they call crop factor. And I myself I've been shooting medium and large format ever since. Nowadays, I switched to digital medium format, which is not full frame per se, because I used to shoot square and it was 6x6 and the sensor you have are 44-33. But I would rather talk about APS sensor and lenses for it. And I know a lot of my colleagues would nag about, oh yeah, crop bodies, crop sensors, it doesn't really look the same, the depth of field, the perspective is different. And I did read, the technical articles on it, and I honestly never noticed any difference, except yes, the depth of field is slightly larger, but to be honest, older I get, I'm less bothered by depth of field as means of expression in my case. But can you just, because obviously Fuji made the deliberate choice to stick either to medium format or to APS sensors. And we touched base a little bit about it before, because, and just for those who missed it, My argument, and we agree on that, is that when Sony came up with full-frame mirrorless cameras, the problem was that the lenses are still massive, so it didn't really save space in your bag, and in my opinion, it affected badly the balance of the camera because it became so front heavy. And if you're going to move into filming, and if you're going to use gimbal, it does represent a challenge to balance those cameras because they're so front heavy. Whereas Fuji made a choice to stick with the APS sensor. So you mentioned some small experiments or samples of basically debunking that argument. So shall we start with that, perhaps?
I mean, we can go there. It's the conversation usually comes out about perspective, right? Yeah. That because you're using a wider angle lens, the perspective somehow changes, right? And perspective and focal length somehow get tied together, and they do have a relationship, but it's more about where the camera's located. Right, so I like to talk about the field of view of a lens. So if I just rewind the tape a little bit here, us making a decision to stick with APS-C was because we wanted the camera to be small, lightweight as a package. We knew when we started doing X series, when we went back, I mean, the X100, that whole experiment, and then into the X Pro, we started looking at it and designing from. We had a blank piece of paper. We didn't have anything that was pre-existing. We weren't looking at, well, this was our lens mount that we used in film or in something else. We didn't have any of that. We had a blank sheet of paper, and we said, okay, if we make this 35 millimeter format, 24 by 36, what does it do to everything? The shutter has to be a certain size. The electronics are a certain size. You need all these components to fit in. Okay, now our lens mount needs to be a certain diameter to cover that frame. And now our lenses. So how big is a 35 millimeter lens? How big is a 50 millimeter lens? And then you start comparing that to, okay, well, what's the imaging advantage? How much advantage do we get with a 35 millimeter size sensor versus an APS-C size sensor? And is there some advantages? Yeah, there's some advantages. It's kind of it's the same arguments I make for GFX. So medium format versus 35 millimeter is the same arguments 35 millimeter makes versus us in APS-C. But it's really about what your needs are, right? If you're reportage or you're trying to be discreet in what you're doing in documentary work, having a slightly smaller camera, a less obtrusive camera, is oftentimes an advantage. And if you're in someplace that's a hostile environment, or a conflict zone where you don't want to draw attention to yourself, or you don't want to have the big Canon camera because you're someplace where you could be, well, in the US right now, I have a friend who's a journalist who's been beaten up on the streets because he's a journalist. And he's changed what he's working with. He's started going to X Pro now because it looks a little bit different. It seems different. People aren't reacting to it the same way. They're even reacting to an XT4 type camera. So, this can even happen here. And even with an APS-C camera, it can happen. But just looking at what you have versus a big Canon and EOS 1 that, like, you got a bullseye on your back. So lots of things there that can possibly make differences. But so field of view, we talk about field of view, and I think a lot of these misconceptions started when the digital revolution really started. So the full frame sensors, a 24 by 36 sensor, really wasn't available early on. They were really expensive, and so they stuck APS-C sensors in because it fit in the camera back. It could fit in the shutter. It could fit in the mechanism of the other cameras. Well, they told you to just use the next longer focal length. So if you wanted to shoot a 35 millimeter lens, you used a 24 on it. And the focal lengths weren't quite right. They felt a little bit off. That 24 is more like a 36. So it really wasn't your 35. So you found yourself standing in a different spot. You took a step back to make it feel like the 35. Well, when we started laying our system out, we started designing lenses so the field of view, so the angle that the lens sees, more closely matches what photographers are used to, right? So Equivalency always to me is dangerous, because when we start looking at moving from 35 millimeter to APS-C, we're changing sensors and we're changing lenses. And so that becomes an interesting little trap. And I like to talk about format more like a cinematographer talks about format. It's really interesting to talk to them that they look at format as to how much area am I capturing. If I have a certain focal length lens mounted right here, if I put a bigger sensor behind it, I'm getting more in. I'm seeing more, as opposed to, well, I won't need a wider angle lens for that. They're looking at it from a different perspective, and it's really kind of interesting. If I fire this up, I have it set up here, and I have some little targets set up that are across from it. So I have a couple little model slot cars sitting up over there, and this is a 19 to 90 millimeter lens. So it's basically a 28 millimeter to 135 equivalent. So right now we're at 90 millimeter, and we're at T2.9. It's a cine lens, so it's transmission values, not f-stops. And we can talk more about that too, if that interests anybody. But if I take this lens and zoom it, you're going to see that as it backs away, the perspective, the position of the two cars, the shape of things doesn't change as I back it away. That I could literally take any of these pictures and as stills and drop them over each other, and they would be the same. So literally, if I want to take a picture from a given location with a wide angle lens, I could actually crop all the other frames out of that lens if I wanted to. The resolution drops, of course, but by keeping the camera in a single position, the perspective doesn't change. This is something you can try at home. I can switch this lens out. We can go to some other things, and you can see it a little bit more. But one of the cool things that I can also show you about this lens, I'm going to just punch in so that the magnification is a little bit higher. And let me just move it down just a hair.
So while you're doing that, that's a cabrio lens,
that's a
right?
cabrio. Yeah.
That's like
as
good as it gets.
Yeah. The other thing that this lens has is its parfocal. So right now we're basically focused on the corner of one of those headlights. And as I change the zoom, my focus doesn't change. My depth of field increases because I'm changing, but it stays focused where I left it. So it's really kind of a powerful tool for a cinematographer, because you can punch in, focus the lens, and then pull back on the lens. And as you zoom the lens, if I want to do a zooming shot, I can rack my zoom in and come in narrower and not have to be adjusting focus while I'm actually racking the lens focal length. So it's really kind of a neat little piece. I'm just going to back it back out again. You know, if I change my f-stop slightly, I'm going to have to change my ISO to keep my brightness the same. But I'm just going to stop it down to T8, because there's another little thing that I wanted to show. As we focus this lens, there's another thing called breathing. And so if I focus on the back car and focus on the front car, you'll notice that the framing doesn't really change. The position of the cars stays in the same spot. And that's called breathing, right? So now you see that they're getting a little bit smaller because they're getting out of focus as I go to infinity. But as we come back into focus and they sharpen up, and where you'll see this in particular is on the edges of a frame, how as the frame will actually narrow. So the field of view will narrow as you focus closer and closer. And that's something about a cine lens, they don't breathe, or they have minimized breathing, so that as you move focus from one subject to another subject, the outer edge of the frame doesn't change radically. And that's really important when you're doing video work.
Or in layman's terms, it looks as if you are zooming in. The effect looks as if you are slightly zooming in, right?
Correct. Yes. Yeah. It becomes distracting to a lot of people because the outer edges will change. It just feels weird to people. And so part of that's why cine lenses are so expensive. So if you're into cinematography, I mean, lenses there are $40, $50, $60,000 sometimes for sets of, primes. Zooms are, more so.
So since we started with the cine lens, you mentioned the T-stop versus, well, not versus, but let's say versus f-stop. Would you clarify that for our people, for our audience here? What's the difference between f-stop and the T-stop?
Sure. I mean, an f-stop is literally a ratio, right? So an f-stop, if I take the focal length of a lens, so just for easy math, let's just say I have a 50mm lens, the exit pupil of the lens, so what the camera sees. So exit pupil, I'm just gonna, is that back piece that you see.
Oh, right? That's like a lens. That's like a lens. Can we show that?
Yeah, that's an old, it's an old manual focus Leica lens. I had it sitting here on my desk just because it was easy to use, right?
It's a good paperweight. Good paperweight.
And as I stop it down, right, the exit pupil gets smaller. I don't even know if you can't even probably see it. Barely see it right now. Yeah. Right. So that's stopped down to f/22 or f/2.8. So the exit pupil. Well, if I take that number and divide that number out, that's how I figure out what my f-stop is, right? So a 50mm lens with a 25mm exit pupil is an f2. To have an f1 lens, it's got to have a 50mm exit pupil. So it determines how big the lens has to be.
Right.
Right. So it's just really a ratio. And it does, to a certain extent, it helps us with exposure. But when we deal with photographic exposure, there's some variance there. In film, we had tons of variance. Digital, it's less so, but the cameras see it now, right? So the camera's metering through the optic. It knows how much light's actually striking it. They talk to each other. It knows that, hey, I did a test when I was in university. I took some optics classes and love optics, love playing around with it. And I ran a test. I took a whole bunch of 50mm lenses. So published 50mm lenses in a row, put them on an optical bench, and I ran a whole battery of tests on them. So measuring everything from what the true focal length was to how accurate the f-stops were on them, and across the board. And it was interesting to see where the tolerances were, right? Some lenses were spot on, there's certain manufacturers have little codes on some of their old lenses that you can, if you know the codes, you can actually unlock the secret to know exactly what focal length it was. And so being able to do that, you could verify that, yeah, I was within a couple, few tenths of a millimeter with what I measured to what they said it was. So to be able to see that, see how accurate the f-stops were. I mean, I had a lens that said it was a 50mm 1.7, and it basically was a 50mm f2. It really didn't go to 1.7. It didn't have another third stop. It just didn't get there. It just didn't get there. And f-stops being, some of them are round, some of them are more octagons or more, 6-sided, 7-sided when they're that big. So it just depends on the manufacturer and what they're trying to do, how they want their out of focus areas to look. Because when you get those apertures in the image through a starburst or whatever, you want a lot of blades if you want a starburst, or really smooth background detail, right? We've all seen pictures where you see a flare block in the background or something, and it looks like a stop sign sitting in the background, at least a US stop sign, and it's not necessarily what you want. So it's just figuring out what fits most needs. In the cine world, because they're shooting motion, because the camera's running and they need these transitions, they need to be able to zoom this lens or change focus on it and not have the exposure change. Because the exposure change you're going to see, right? They can't, it's hard for them to edit that piece out, or they have to cut, change it. It's really more difficult. So they use T-stops, transmission stops. So it's more about measuring the light value out the back of the lens. And so a lens like this, as I zoom it and the focal length changes, the position of the aperture in there moves along with it so that it keeps a constant aperture, or it has a mechanism to open it up sometimes. So that's really kind of a neat thing. And as I change focus too, sometimes with focus moving elements farther away, make some small changes in this. And that's another reason why these are so expensive, but the cinema world uses T-stops just for accuracy. Not that it's anything really much different. It's really quite similar. If you would measure what this lens is in f-stops, it's a T2.9. It's going to come out to basically probably in f-stops, it's going to come out probably slightly faster.
Yeah.
It's going to show as a little bit faster in an f-stop because the t-stop, usually the aperture is slightly down. There's usually, if I would look through the back of this, even at 19 millimeter, I'm going to see a bit of the aperture blades.
Right.
I'm not going to see wide open through the glass that I would see if I didn't have an aperture in it, because wanting to control that and needing it to be precise. So it's just a different level of precision.
And so I have to ask you this, because I'm sure there's people here who are interested, and we mentioned that before. I love lenses that allow me to correct or adjust perspective, and been shooting a lot with, I had various ideas and ways of going around it. So I used Nikon perspective control lenses, Canon, who has a great tilt shift lenses, but now as I supposed to shoot something which with Fuji, with medium format, which I would like to do with tilt shift. So how come this particular niche, which admittedly is very, very small, none of, if I recall well, none of the medium format manufacturers really make tilt shift lenses. Hasselblad has that clumsy, horrible device that you have to mount in between the lens and the camera, costs arm and a leg. Phase One has this compact solution, which again is just insanely expensive, and I think still clumsy, and it's still not a tilt shift lens, but rather a mechanism on the camera. And then there is a combo device, which is sort of a bellows based device. But as far as I know, not a single medium format camera manufacturer today makes tilt shift. I think Mamiya used to make one ages ago. It was like a 50, which was only a shift lens, but that was like 45 years ago. And I think Russian, what's the name of that lens? It's a beautiful lens that is a medium format tilt shift lens, Super Rotat or something like that. But in terms of modern lenses, and including Fuji, there's nothing like that around. Wow. I mean, are we ever going to get it?
I mean, I think it's definitely something that we talk about and that we have interest in, because there is need in the marketplace. Medium format, there's been a couple manufacturers, like you said. Pentax had one too that was actually a tilt shift lens. Pretty rare, pretty uncommon to find today, but it's hard, right? We used to make view camera lenses. We used to make lenses for 8x10s, 4x5. I mean, there's famous ads of ours with Richard Avedon talking about our lenses. And so we have technology, we know how to make view camera lenses. But when you're talking about a tilt shift lens, you really need the optic to be doing different things. So the front half of the optic doing something, the back half staying in position and moving the light through it. So they tend to be big, they tend to be complex. And also just the engineering on it, having gearing, having the mechanism to move it and tilt and shift it without it optically causing problems, right? So when you look at things, in optics, oftentimes we talk about centering lenses.
Yeah.
And so there's through a piece of glass, optical glass, when it has a curve on it, there's an optical center in it. And so how do you keep those things lined up? How do you keep that ray of light going through the middle the same? And as it tilts and shifts, you got to keep those things the same and aligned. So it's a little bit more complex. They're big. They tend to be big, complex, expensive. So we just want to make sure we get it right too. And that's part of it. And there is some other solutions out there right now for people that are trying to do it. But it's definitely something that is optically a bit challenging. And we recognize that and see that, but we also see it as a need and a demand in the marketplace. So I would say it's something that to me is very fascinating. I grew up shooting a lot of view camera and a lot of architecture. So I find that really kind of beautiful. I love a tilt shift lens, what you can do with it and just the capabilities. And the other problem is optics, right? Like we make a view camera adapter, we make a graph lock back adapter that I can throw our GFX cameras on a view camera. But most of the old view camera lenses aren't that sharp.
Yes.
And because it didn't have to be, because they were big film, 4x5 film. To make an 8x10 print, it's a 2x enlargement. It's not a very big enlargement. And so the lenses didn't have to be quite as sharp as we need for digital. Digital sees everything. I've done a couple tests a couple times with people, and woo, you see every little thing. So a lot of the lenses just don't have the movement. So there's digitar type lenses, or there's digital design view camera lenses that have been done for those kind of shift cameras. Alpha makes one, and a couple other people make them, that let you do lens rise and fall, back, side to side, just that you could stitch multiple frames together if you shoot panoramics. There's lots of stuff out there, but the coverage of the lenses is pretty small.
Yeah.
And shutters are a problem, right? Most of those old view camera lenses use leaf shutters, yeah. And Copal and a few other manufacturers are the famous makers of those leaf shutters. They're pretty much done making. They've pretty much all stopped making leaf shutters anymore. So availability is limited. And part of the problem that we have is our camera's got a focal plane shutter in it. So it creates a little bit more space. It needs a little bit more setback. So some of those wide angle lenses from view cameras, you can't use because you can't get the lens close enough to the camera body. So lots of little things, but I think there's definitely a marketplace for it. It's something exciting to me that I think is really kind of cool. I'm always paying attention to what everyone's doing in that space. And, there's lots of solutions out there with adapters. I mean, I've seen people adapt some of those crazy, is it Harbitel or something like that?
Hardbly, yeah.
That makes some crazy tilt shift lenses for, I think they made it for Kiev cameras and stuff over the years. People are doing all kinds of fun stuff. And that's one of the fun things to me about mirrorless is I have adapters for GFX that I can put all kinds of lenses on. I can put anything from a Mamiya 7 lens to an X-Pan type lens, so TX1 or Hasselblad X-Pan lens, to a Leica M lens, to an R lens, to Canon EOS, to Nikon, you name it, we can put it on there. And it's kind of a cool thing. And same thing with then when we look at the X series, we can do the same thing. We have all these capabilities. There's companies out there making autofocus adapters for lenses that were never autofocus. They have little motor drive systems in them to actually autofocus the lens. It's really kind of cool. To me, we're in a great age where I can pick and choose. I can take something like that old Leica lens I had on my desk earlier, and I can use that for photography again. It's now not a paperweight anymore. And I think that comes down to looking at lenses for reasons and look and feel of lenses. Like certain lenses just have a feel to them and a style to them. And we design lenses with style to them. And we very cognizant of that, right? We have in our X series line, we have a 35-1.4.
Yeah.
And it's a classic Zeiss planar type design, double Gauss, beautiful optic. It just has this look to it. It has a very distinct look. And the way it renders out of focus areas, it's just absolutely beautiful. When you do a more modern design, oftentimes people will comment, oh, it's very clinical. It's very sterile, right? Everything looks clean. It's sharp across the frame. It's just like really beautiful. And there's a place for both. And so that's one of the things that we try to do when we're designing lenses. We design what we refer to them as character lenses, or more of a modern optical design. And so it's just a question of what your needs are.
We have quite a few questions, but I have one that you said earlier, that digital sees everything. And there's one thing that I'm still not used to when it comes to digital. I feel that, and I'm not sure I'm going to explain it properly, but I have a feeling that digital is more unforgiving when it comes to images that are not tech sharp. Okay. Mm-hmm. So for example, back when I was shooting film, medium format, right? I so wasn't bothered by making images, tech sharp, pin sharp, because the film rendered my mistake, my error, mm-hmm. in much more, let's say, in smoother or more eye-pleasing way. Now, when I'm shooting digital, that when I make an error and I don't make a tech sharp image, it displeases me more than on film. I don't know if I explain myself well.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And so I was just looking for things on my desk. So if this coaster
So my question is, why is that?
Well, part of it's this. So this is film, right? Film has thickness to it. It had dye layers in it. It had depth to it. If I compare that, that's kind of what digital is. It's a single plane. So it's less forgiving, there's less errors to it. So when you miss focus on digital, it looks like you really missed focus on digital.
So margin for error is smaller because of this physical thickness, right?
Because of physical thickness, right? So, and it's all, things show up like chromatic aberration shows up, because if a lens isn't apochromatic or isn't optimized for that sensor, if the red light focuses 1 pixel over, you now get a funky shift and you get a line of red around something. And so there's lots of little things that's a big piece of it, is the actual, like the photo sites that we're using now that are measuring the light are tiny, right? They're way smaller than any grain of film ever was. And when we did film, we had different size grain in it. There was bigger grain, smaller grain, and you know, it kind of massaged everything and ran it through a little bit of a blender, so to speak, right? And so it made it more forgiving, that if your focus was off just a little bit, maybe the silver at the bottom of the film
picked it up
a little bit sharper than the silver at the top of the film. And so you kind of had a little bit of a leeway here. But in the sensor, it's just the top surface. Think about it just being the top surface of the film. So if the focus was a little bit behind that, it's going to look soft, and it's going to look immediately soft. And it's one of those things, I think when you shoot digital enough, you start to see that super sharpness and the fall off of sharpness. And I think it's also lens design and just lens systems. As manufacturers have been going to mirrorless cameras, I think they've been designing the sharpness point of lenses to be higher, the actual resolving power. If you go back and look at old lenses and MTF charts and go into, you know, modulation transfer functions and go down that rabbit hole, you'll see lenses of how many line pairs they could reproduce. Well, pretty much every modern lens is reproducing probably twice as much line pairs, if not 3 or 4 times more line pairs, because they're sharper. They're actually physically sharper. And part of this was to accommodate variance. We look at an SLR camera, we have the mirror's in the way, right? So the light comes in the lens, strikes the mirror, goes up to the prism and to your eye, but then the autofocus sensor is in the bottom of the camera, right? So that mirror is bouncing light down and bouncing light up. And that's, so it's focusing on a little sensor down here that now has to be perfectly aligned with the image plane in the back. And so if there's any error there, we have error in focus, we have back focus. And then, you know, that causes softness or causes the lens to be sharp here, not sharp there. But also then we have things like focus shift. Now, I don't know if you've ever experienced that. You know, you focus the lens wide open. In more manual focus, we experience this more. You take like a 51.4, focus it wide open, and then you stop that lens down to say 2.8 or 4. The depth of field actually shifts back in the lens. Right. So there's a variance to where the depth of field really goes, even not changing the focus. Not so it's still focused, just to say it's focused on 2 meters the whole time. If I focus it wide open optically at 1.4, I stop it down to f2, it drifts, that depth of field drifts backward. So when people say, you know, okay, I'm focused on 2 meters, my depth of field is 1/3 in front, 2/3 behind. No, it's not. It's not always that case. It's something, in general, in theory and in practice, you know, in theory, yes, it's 1/3 in front, 2/3 behind, roughly. But as that lens stops down, you get this slight drifts and shifts and things. And fast lenses experience that way more than slow lenses. So if I make a lens that's an f2.8, it's not going to have as much of that. And then when I get to f4, usually between 2.8 and 4 is the worst spot. Usually by the time you hit 5.6, the depth of field's great enough that it covers up any sins there by the designer.
Let's get to some of the questions, which are actually very interesting. So the first one by Mike Zerby, apologize if I didn't pronounce well, has to do with tilt shift. So, and I think we can both answer it. So the question by Mike is, has tilt shift been replaced by software solutions? Photoshop can skew and so on. So what's the difference? Is it still pure or accurate? Let me just answer it from my perspective. Mike, in my case, tilt shift lenses, partially, of course, you use it to correct falling lines, converging, sorry, or diverging lines and so on. But in my case, why I really like tilt shift lenses is that I can find a perfect spot for my shot, find perfect, position in relation to the subject focal length I have, but then I can adjust, for example, amount of image I see vertically. So it's not always, in my case, in so many cases, for me, it's not about fixing those skewed lines because, by the way, Photoshop does it perfectly, but it also does it at expense of cropping, which means you're going to lose part of image. So forget about resolution. All the cameras by now have so much resolution, you can crop as much as you can, but you actually cut parts of the image, which I want to keep in. So from my perspective, that's the reason why I use it. The term pure or puristic, I think that's really reserved for photojournalism, where you are trying to be as little involved, so to speak, into content that you are showing to the viewers. So I think that's a whole different conversation. Do you have anything to add on this?
I was going to agree with you 100%. Basically, having that rise and fall capability or shift left and right, being able to, okay, you put a 16-foot ladder in front of the building, and you're up there on top of the ladder with the camera, clamped to the top of the ladder, and you want to be at 22 feet, and you can't get there.
Exactly.
Right, having that bit of rise or a little bit of fall to be able to put the camera someplace in space that you can't physically be is really, to me, the super powerful thing about that. You're absolutely right. With Photoshop, we can correct perspective, the keystoning, all those things can actually do an amazing job of that. You drop a line on something, it's level and straight, but you lose stuff with crop, right? You're changing the resolution. You might not get the same sky. You might get a little variance in what you're looking at. So definitely, I think you're spot on there with that. There's still a need. And it's really I think an important need.
So it's more of a, for me, it's more of a composing tool rather than just fixing diverging or converging lines. And also a question by Mike, which goes after this one. Some say if you do it in camera, it's okay, but if you do it in software, it's lying. Again, the question of lying or telling the truth, it's as philosophical as it gets, but I think it's really reserved. All these answers are really reserved for the genre of photography that you're operating in and your audience. Which means if you're a fashion photographer, all bets are off. It's up to you. Do whatever you want to get the image you want. But if you're someone who's trying to report and send back an actual information, an accurate information of certain event, especially when it involves people, human lives, violence, politics, whatever, then it doesn't matter where you do your manipulation. And when I say manipulation, I also mean if you're going to tell someone to move left or right so you can get that particular picture of, I don't know, street violence or whatever, or you're going to do something in your camera to make it look differently, or you're going to clone or cut away, or well, not cut away, or clone something in or out in your Photoshop, that's lying, of course. But like I said, that's really a conversation that it's framed around the genre and of photography that you're operating in. So, but if you lie, you're lying inside or outside camera, right? Except in some fields, it's totally normal to lie because you are creating an illusion and just using photography as a medium. But if you are in business of documenting something like I am, well, then the rules are very, very, very simple. You can't do any of that in or outside the camera. And yes, some agencies, I think Reuters, probably others as well, they are now insisting on their photographers shooting JPEGs only, in-camera JPEG. So they would have brand new cameras being capable of creating marvelous RAW files, but they are obliged to shoot JPEGs and to transmit files from in-camera. So basically no more Photoshop. You just do your caption in Photomechanic or whatever and send that actual image. And it did help, but it did help with manipulation, because there were some cases with various agencies where people cloned things in or out, serious things, but it doesn't have an effect of manipulation in field. Basically, when you are with your subject and you ask the subject to do a certain thing, well, no JPEG is going to sort that out. Anyway, sorry, I answered this question. I felt it's a bit up to my alley, but let's see. There's another question which is very up to your alley. So Daniel Gomez is asking, does the issue of sharpness persist if you use an old analog lens with an adapter to a mirrorless digital camera, for example?
Oh, most assuredly it exists. I mean, you can get some wonderful effects and looks out of it. Try it out and see what you get. I have actually taken, my wife's a photographer, and I've actually taken some little old enlarger lenses. So this is a little old 50 millimeter f3.5 enlarger lens that I ripped apart, took all the glass elements out of it but one, and left the aperture ring in it. And so I adapted one of these to mount on one of her X series cameras, and you can't focus it. It's a fixed focus. It focuses at about 1.5 meters is where the focus is on it, but it has a really dreamlike quality to it. Nothing sharp on it, wide open. And as you slowly stop the aperture down, things get sharper and sharper on it, and it actually looks quite beautiful. But it's a lot like the old Kodak, instant brownie type cameras, right? Like the old you push the button, we do the rest type thing. That it has that beautiful look to it, and it's a little bit dreamlike and a little bit. It's soft, just for lack of a better word. It's soft and dreamlike, but it has a point. She uses it for some of her work that's more fine art based, that she wants that look and appearance to things, that if it is a dream, if it is someone like sleepwalking, it kind of fits that nature. Might not be appropriate for a photojournalistic assignment, but for fine art, it's playing, it's being creative, and it's going out and trying to see what else you can make out there.
Here is an interesting question. Very interesting on a very different topic. It's by anonymous attendee. So in some situations, I'd like to have a camera that encrypt the images directly on the card. Is it even possible technically, legally? Would it be relevant, sustainable, update-wise? Maybe with a fingerprint? Thanks a lot for your inputs. I think it's actually a very interesting question, because it happened to me that, certain people would, I would get into trouble and they would get out the card or whatever. And I wish I could have those files encrypted. Not because people who would take your cards, they don't really care about copyright, and I'm sure you can't be suing them for copyright violation, but I would like to disable it in some way so they can't use it. They can destroy it, but they couldn't use it. Is that a thing to do? Is it possible?
It's really an interesting concept. I'd like to know a little bit more about what they're thinking, but I know Adobe is working on something with, I always want to give the wrong acronym here. It's CAI, Content Authenticity Initiative.
Yep.
Right.
It's
and so
brilliant.
it is brilliant. It's basically putting like a bit chain key into your photograph. And so someone takes your photograph, manipulates it, does something with it, you can hunt for that. That key stays in the image file. It's permanently embedded in the metadata of that file. And even if it gets layered in other software, it can be found and be, identified. So really kind of cool. I think that's going to ultimately come out and be something kind of cool in the future. So I think there's definitely some needs for things like that. You know, I think security of images is definitely important, and it's something I don't know why there's any reason why it couldn't be done. Especially with journalists and everything that's happened. My one friend from Seattle Times actually had the Seattle Times was taken to court and had to turn over all of his frames from covering protests. And he was very upset with it. The Seattle Times was very upset with it because, right, that's protecting his, you know, his job, his livelihood, and also protecting people, right? That the government being able to identify who was there, that gets to be a little dangerous. And so I think there's definitely some thought process there, but I would still think in some way there would have to be a way to unencrypt in a situation like that. I mean, it's kind of I think with the same battle that Apple's going with the iPhone, that if you know, someone commits a crime and they got their iPhone on them, can Apple give them data to actually track the person's whereabouts? I think that, you know, it's going to be an interesting legal thing, but I think that's really kind of a cool idea and concept. I can see it having lots of uses for, you know, good uses and bad uses, and I just wonder if that's part of the concern there, is that it could have good and bad uses to it ultimately.
But it's interesting.
I like that idea. I like the idea. You know, next time I get the engineers on the phone, I think I'm going to ask about that.
And I don't think any camera manufacturer is currently involved in this content authenticity initiative, right?
As far as I know, no one's involved in it. Yeah, it's just something that's sprung up on my radar recently. That's really kind of a cool idea, I think.
I think it goes beyond cool. I think it's absolutely necessary. But I do think that to make that initiative viable for professionals, now we are strictly talking about people who are involved in broader sense documentary. I think without having camera manufacturers in it, I think some of the camera manufacturers should get on it, just to make the whole circle. Now we have the media in it, we have software, you know, companies, but I think because it's all digital and because, you know, it's all you know, binary, I think camera manufacturer will have to jump on that wagon. Anyway, let me just see other questions. We still have time for a few more. And David it's more of a comment. He says, for legal protections in the old days, some newspapers would destroy all negatives that were not published. That's one way to go.
Yeah, someone asked a question I saw about pinholes and exposures.
Yes, please do. That was my next one. So
I have this sitting on my desk, an old Gossen LunaPro light meter.
That was my first. Let me just read out the question so everyone knows what we're talking about. Alex Carvalho is asking, I'm trying to photograph with a pinhole camera. I have the question, these questions. Let's say I have a 0.5 millimeter pinhole and a 50 millimeter focal length, f-stop 100. Is there a reference for the exposure time? Justin.
Well, I mean, in the old days, things like this goes down to f128, right? So it would get you in the ballpark to be able to do it. There's going to be out there in photo sort of old manuals and old sort of photo 101 kind of things. You're going to find that equivalent exposure thing that you can print on three pieces of paper and put one of those little silver clips through it, a hole in the middle of it, that you can rotate the 3 dials. That'll help you do it. But just as like a frame of reference here, if I was shooting 400 speed film, and I'm going to assume the sunny f16 roll. So it's sunny day, 400 speed film. I'm 400th of a second at f16. You're about an 1/8 of a second at f100. So that would get you in the right ballpark. I mean, you can count the number of stops in between from 16 to 128, 22, 32, 45, 64, 90, 128 would put you there. So that gets you in the right ballpark.
So try to get one of these.
There's templates out there. I'll do a quick little Google here and see if I can find one. And if I find it, I'll drop it into the chat.
Okay, and we have time for one more question from Margot. In 2 weeks, the California coast will get a lunar eclipse on May 26th. So I assume Margot is asking, what lens and menu settings do you recommend for photographing the moon at sunset? It's a full moon, so it rises at sunset and will be in lunar eclipse. So what Fuji gear would you recommend and these settings, if you can do it from your desk?
Well, I mean, it's just going to be a question of how big do you want the moon to be, right? That's ultimately the question. So what focal length you need. But the exposure for the moon, it's actually reflected sunlight. So you can get a pretty rough example of what the actual exposures on the moon by what a daylight exposure would be. So that's just a quick frame of reference to get you in the right ballpark for how bright the moon is equivalent to a full sun daylight exposure. That being said, but usually I try to pick a long lens. So I try to use, oftentimes I'm looking at the moon, a 100 to 400 lens of ours. Something in that focal length makes the moon kind of nice in the frame and you can see a lot of detail in it. You know, the eclipse and that edge of it, the way the earth moving in front and blocking the sun out, you know, that's always a little bit tricky. But what I would tell you, there's where mirrorless cameras really are beautiful. You can actually see what you're getting. You see the exposure as it's happening, and being able to zoom in and look at the actual exposure and look at the brightness values of it. Those are really powerful tools that you can use while you're actually there looking at it, seeing it, and it's happening in front of you. Where you're not having to shoot film and go, well, hit playback, did I get it? Hit playback, did I get it? You can actually see the brightness values in the monitor and in the display.
Sorry, it's Margot again. Okay, I have a mirrorless and we'll bring it along with my DSLR. Okay, well, hope that helped, Margot. Thank you very much. I think we covered all of the questions. Well, there's actually one more by Donald, but I'm not sure I understand it well, so I'll just read it out. What is the characteristics and benefits of your Fuji 24mm 1.4 and 135 f2? Do you have 135 f2?
No, I would have to convert those. So a 24 1.4 would be a 16mm f1.4, which is absolutely one of my favorite lenses. I love something that wide, and it is extremely sharp. A lot of people use that for shooting stars for astrophotography because it is such a lovely wide focal length and is really well corrected at 1.4 especially. It's a fantastic lens. And then the 135 focal length would be a 90mm on our sensor. And we make a 90 f2, which is, I would say, sort of the twin lens to the 56 f1.2 that a lot of people really love.
Oh yeah,
fat 56, which is an 85mm equivalent roughly. The 90 there, I mean, to me, 135 is it's an old focal length in my opinion. That is just a beautiful focal length of lens for shooting portraits, for shooting headshots. The really pleasing perspective you get out of that lens, and they just tend to be super sharp. There's for some reason in photography, there's certain focal lengths that really sing, and some of them are a little bit odd. And some of them are things that I love, like 135s. I love 180mm lenses. For some reason, there's an old Zeiss lens from the 30s called an Olympia Sonar.
F2.8. F2.8.
F2.8.
Right? Yeah,
that lens just is beautiful and has a beautiful quality to it. And every other 180 I've ever shot with. I mean, V-System Hasselblads, I shoot a 180 a lot. I love that focal length. And that lens just tends to optically sing and be really beautiful. So I think there's some little secrets there that are really kind of cool and fun. But I think it's finding your own vision and finding what lenses suit you and the work you want to do best and the character that you like to have in your work and sort of that signature that you want. You know, is everything super sharp and perfect? You know, we have lenses. We just brought out a new 18mm f1.4, but we have an older 18mm f2 that a lot of the I'm going to call them the techie pixel peepers complain about because the corners are a little soft and it's got a little bit of field curvature. When we designed that lens, we had the X Pro. We had one mirrorless camera at that point. So we had an X Pro, which is kind of, you know, a little bit of a rangefinder type camera, really kind of inspired by those cameras. And when we designed that lens, we designed it to have a little bit of field curvature in it. And it really feels like those older Leica lenses from the 50s that had that little bit of field curvature. And from a journalistic standpoint, I love them because they lead your eye in. They lead your eye into the center of the frame because usually that's where the subject was towards the center. And so having that little bit of field curvature just created a little bit of visual interest for the viewer of a photograph. And it's just finding ways to make that work and different designs and different things. So now we have an 18 millimeter 1.4 that's super sharp, a spherical lens, you know, really flat field, really high resolution. It's a different feel. It's a different look. It doesn't have the same character that the F2 has. And the F2 is a little pancake. So we're trying to make lenses for different applications and different uses that can suit multiple people, right? We could take that 1.4 image that's super sharp and soften it up in Photoshop or in post-production. But do we want to do that? Do we want to go that direction? And with a journalistic slant, we probably don't want to do that. But it's always good to capture more data when you can. But there's different needs for different people.
And there is last minute question, which I think you should answer, from David Austin. How does Fuji suggest we avoid or address, inverted commas, focus creep with the latest Fuji cameras? I'm not sure what do you mean by focus creep? Do you know, Justin? David, can you clarify a little bit? I never heard for focus creep, so I don't know what does he refer to.
I don't know what he's referring to there exactly as creep. I know people oftentimes will hear, if they manually focus a lens, they'll hear the lens stop the aperture down or make an adjustment for the aperture if it focused wide open. So say, you know, a 56 1.2, you focus it at 1.2, but you're actually shooting at 2.8. The lens will actually make the slight correction for the 2.8.
Okay, so David just came in. We actually answered the question. You answered the question earlier. Anyway, thank you very much, Justin. Thank you everyone for being with us. Make sure to check out the calendar on 7 Insider and Photo Wings, and for that matter, 7 Foundation, and see what's there out for you. Justin, thank you very much as always. Great pleasure. Take care. Good luck, everyone. Thanks for being with us. Bye.